son, ay, ahí se me fue un poquito la idea, no sé si tú
Sí, que
puedes.
no, no es una batalla entre la verdad y la mentira, sino entre la verdad y la realidad. Que ese es el debate.
Ujú.
You want to add something, Dave?
No, I'll take the next question.
Okay, Pablo? You want me to go ahead?
Yeah, please,
No,
please,
one
Gabriel.
of the things that we have been assessing is that the Mexican institutions are quite weak, and the democratic culture is relatively new in Mexico. And when we have to defend them, sometimes it's not easy to communicate this to the majorities because they don't understand why do we need to defend them. What is your reading, and how can we attract these majorities to get involved into the defense of our institutions?
Yeah. Well, people do have people are attracted by the promise of a better life, and so long as the oil money or whatever resource the authoritarian leader has, Hugo Chavez, whoever it is, they will sprinkle money about the landscape, taking most for themselves. Um, and people think, well, at least that's something. So I think, from my impression, one of the things that Mexico, that civil society in Mexico needs is to join liberal, in the broad sense of the word, constitutional ideas to meaningful social reforms that are secure. I mean, one of the things that, and I'll say I'm speaking too long for the translator, but one of the ways you can tell an authoritarian leader is that when people get benefits in a legal society, they're not expected to say thank you. If you go to the hospital in Germany and get medical treatment, no one thinks you should say thank you to the chancellor. If you get a pension in Britain, no one thinks that you owe a special thank you to the prime minister. You retain your right to disagree, even as you share in all of the benefits that other citizens do. And Mexico's legal and constitutional institutions are connected to the success of the campaign against informality, bringing everyone into the tax system, and extending then social benefits in a more universal way than has been the case.
Danish?
Ok, sí. Lo que dice es que las personas buscan siempre tener una buena vida, y, o sea, tener una vida feliz, y que lo que buscan es que los gobiernos sean autoritarios, les den lo que sea, aunque sea algo, pero reciben algo. Entonces esto para ellos es un beneficio. Y, por ejemplo, en Alemania, la gente, aunque esté en contra del gobierno o no están de acuerdo con sus políticas, ellos reciben ayuda social, y no por ello tienen que dar gracias. Igual en Inglaterra y en otros países donde las instituciones sí son fuertes y funcionan, y no por ello es algo que tengan que estar cambiando o sea, no reciben esto a cambio de eso, porque son los mismos impuestos que se usan para eso, y todos tenemos el derecho a recibirlos.
Es correcto. Él hace el ejemplo de le das las gracias al sistema, no le das las gracias al líder cuando recibes algún tipo de servicio público, que forma parte de una obligación del Estado. Entonces, como para que la gente se entusiasme y quiera participar y defender sus instituciones, tiene que salir y primero reconocer que este es un servicio que le da el Estado, no se lo da el líder. Y en esa medida, pues bueno, va a defender a las instituciones. So you want to follow up on this, Dave?
No, I'll take we'll double back, and let's take another question, and then we'll double back to it.
Okay. So one of the analysis that we have done in this conversation is in these forums regularly, we discuss about the triangle between the military, the organized crime, and the authoritarian regime of López Obrador. And in this context, we see the citizens defenseless. So we are naked. So how can,
Yes.
what is in your view? How can we defend ourselves of these threats?
Yes. I'm telling you here about your own country that you know better than me, and you don't need someone from the outside to tell you what is obvious. That you need a proper police force, you need a proper judiciary. Let me talk, instead of telling you what you need to do, because you know better. Talk a little bit about the fourth piece. It's not a triangle; it's a square, and that is the role of the United States. And one of the things I observed in my reporting is there's a very unfortunate continuity in the Mexico policy of Joe Biden with that of Donald Trump, which is the United States has had a very short list of things it wants. Lopez Obrador is very willing to grant those things, mostly migration control. And in return, the United States has looked the other way as Mexican democracy has been damaged in ways that I think we would not look the other way with countries that were less important to the United States than Mexico is.
Yeah. Dani.
Ok. Lo que dicen, bueno, preguntan cómo defendernos del crimen organizado cuando ahorita es un triángulo entre el militarismo, el crimen organizado y el gobierno, ¿no? Entonces, dice que lo importante es tener una fuerza de policía fuerte, una fuerza de policía correcta, el Estado de Derecho, y que, bueno, él puso, dice, no puede venir a decirnos qué es lo que tenemos que tener nosotros en México, pero en Estados Unidos lo que funciona es que, bueno, Estados Unidos y tanto Trump como Joe Biden tenían estas políticas migratorias, las que usaron con López Obrador para, de alguna manera, decir, ok, hacemos esto, pero nosotros nos vamos a hacer de la vista omisa y dejar que el crimen avance, ¿no?
Yeah. David?
Yes. So, because a lot of the United States is involved in a lot of the insecurity in Mexico. It's Americans who buy the drugs that are carried by the criminal cartels. It's Americans who employ the migrants who are carried by the criminal cartels. It's America that sends the guns. And at this point, the problem is so big. It may be a problem too heavy for Mexican institutions to lift all by themselves without help from partners, of which the United States is not the only one. It's the most important one, but it's not the only one. And so we need to think about how do we make sure that the Army, there must be enormous pressure from the U.S. military to their Mexican counterparts to say a lot of your legitimacy with the United States, which the Mexican military cares about, depends on you not doing the things that democratic militaries should not do.
Dani, Patrick.
Sí. Lo que dice es que Estados Unidos tiene mucho que ver en la inseguridad de México, porque finalmente, pues ellos son los que traen drogas, ellos son los que también consumen la droga, son los que traen las armas, y pues no puede solo México. Es tan grande el problema que ya llegó a tal nivel que tendrían que buscar socios en otros países, porque no, ya rebasa cualquier otra posibilidad. ¿Y cómo hacemos para que el ejército de Estados Unidos sea un aliado? Y la última parte me medio perdí. No sé si tú la tienes.
No. Pablo, did you get ¿tuviste la última parte, Pablo?
Sí, que debe de haber una presión de Estados Unidos a el gobierno mexicano a tener prácticas democráticas, sobre todo del ejército, de poner ciertas condiciones de cooperación y de sociedad para que digamos que el matrimonio entre el gobierno civil y el ejército la sigan. De lo contrario, puede haber sanciones.
Dave, do you want to follow on this? Or
yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah. The United States is the premier supplier of military equipment in the world, and we see in Ukraine how much superior American equipment is to anybody else's. All militaries want this equipment, but we should have the closest relationships only with militaries that occupy a proper democratic place, and that are not engaged in repression of citizens, and are not engaged in police work, and are not taking over large parts of the civilian economy. And there should be consequences in the availability of both hard and soft military technology with militaries that don't observe their proper limits.
Estados Unidos es el primer proveedor de equipo para guerra en el mundo. Y debemos de tener, bueno, Estados Unidos debe de tener una mejor relación con los países que sí protegen la democracia, las libertades y el Estado de Derecho, y no suplir a países que pues están oprimiendo a su población y cometen crímenes como de lesa humanidad, etcétera, ¿no? Y que debe de haber consecuencias al respecto, porque si sigue Estados Unidos proveyendo a países que no están dentro de las, digamos, de libertades, derecho, democracia, pues es lo que ha pasado, que simplemente siguen alimentando países que finalmente van a hacer guerra, pero aún, oprimiendo a su mismo país, ¿no? A su población, y abusando de su poder.
Pablo?
Sí.
Go ahead.
All right, let's keep talking about the United States, David. The elections next year in both the United States and Mexico are going to be spliced. The Mexican one is a few months earlier, and everything seems to indicate that the López Obrador regime prefers Trump and vice versa. Mm-hmm. How do you think the different actors will play on this stage?
Well, I think we're moving. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think we are moving into a very hazardous moment in U.S.-Mexican relations. The idea is spreading, not idea. The rhetoric is spreading among Trump supporters that there needs to be a direct U.S. military role in Mexico against the fentanyl cartels. With Mexican approval, if that's possible, without Mexican approval, if not. Now, I don't think any of the people, or very few of the people who are saying this, mean this seriously. It's just something to say on television. It sounds tough as a response to this terrible fentanyl crisis. But this kind of talk can take on a life of its own.
Thank you, David. Dice que, bueno, Pablo le pregunta que el siguiente año van a haber elecciones en Estados Unidos como en México, con algunos meses de diferencia, y que cómo veía un poquito la situación de ambos países en estas elecciones. Y bueno, David contesta que México y Estados Unidos está entrando en una relación muy peligrosa en cuanto a que la retórica básicamente es con Trump, y Trump está difundiendo que el ejército de Estados Unidos debe de meterse en México con o sin su autorización para manejar el problema del fentanilo.
You want to comment on this, Pablo?
No, I'll let David just keep going.
As I said, I do want to stress that it is important to say that the politicians who talk in this way, and we're not talking about like random people on television. We're talking about members of the United States Senate, members of the United States House. Donald Trump has even said some of these things, and he's the likely front runner for the Republican presidential nomination. They want to sound like they have something to suggest about fentanyl that is easy and quick and decisive and powerful, and that uses military resources, and they are readying the mind of the country for interventions that are, as I say, with Mexican cooperation if possible, but without it if not. It's a way they talk, but it's something that may become something they stumble into having to do should they have political success and win.
Bueno, esta misma retórica la están llevando al Senado y a todos los niveles del Congreso, y básicamente Trump lo que está vendiendo para su elección es que con o sin la autorización de México tienen que haber una intervención en México del ejército de Estados Unidos y contra la guerra del fentanilo, contra el crimen organizado.
So, David, a follow-up question on that is, don't you think this will push Joe Biden a little bit to the right in order to sort of not seem easy on the border?
That has already, sorry, you want to translate?
Traduce tu pregunta, Pablo, porque le están pidiendo que nosotros traduzcamos las preguntas.
Bueno, lo que le pregunté a David es que con la retórica intervencionista de Trump, si eso no empujará a Biden justamente hacia la derecha para no parecer que pues es muy suave con la frontera. Es decir, un poco para seguir a Trump, para no perder a esa parte del electorado que también quiere una política dura en la frontera.
Go ahead.
Well, we've already seen the Biden administration has, in some ways, done this deal. That López Obrador has delivered quiet on the border with the expiration of the Trump era pandemic migration control rules. Everyone in the United States was talking about or predicting a huge surge in migration. That did not happen because of the very harsh methods being used inside Mexico, and some of which have had very tragic consequences for human life, that terrible fire at the detention facility. The Biden administration seems to be taking the view that so long as American hands are clean, it is quite happy to see this work be done by the Mexicans. And the Mexican government is quite happy to do this work, but it has a price. And the price is that Biden keep his mouth shut about Mexican democracy. And by and large, the United States has done that. I mean, when you think about how much we talk about democracy in other places and how little we've spoken officially about what's happened in Mexico over the past few years.
Bueno, David Frum dice que Biden ya lo ha hecho y se ha callado. Lo vemos en la frontera, por ejemplo, ahorita con lo de la pandemia, pues no hubo nada, absolutamente nada, ningún apoyo, ninguna actividad ni nada, al contrario, no sucedió nada y más bien hemos visto una gran, tragedia como sucedió en el incendio que hubo en el centro de detención en la frontera, y un poco es que México va a pagar el precio, o sea, México, digamos, paga el precio de dejar que Biden haga lo que quiere en la frontera, a cambio de que Biden no va a decir nada acerca de la democracia, de que no está, o sea, más bien que no se está metiendo en cuanto a estos abusos de poder y pues la amenaza que tenemos en nuestra misma democracia.
Wow. You want to follow on this, Dave?
No, I'll take the next one.
Okay. Well, actually, for me, it's a follow-up of what you have just mentioned, because what we lived in Mexico during 70 years of government, of PRI government, the U.S. accommodated very well and to deal with a neighbor at the southern border, which was not exactly democratic. What do you think that the U.S. should be doing if we end up living what we faced a few years ago when the PRI was in power?
Mm-hmm.
Will you let me translate that?
No, déjale. Let me translate this. Sorry. Yeah. No, le estoy preguntando que cómo debe de reaccionar, que México por muchos años vivió durante 70 años con el PRI, que no era necesariamente una democracia funcional y que los Estados Unidos se acomodaron fácilmente a tener como vecino un vecino que no necesariamente era democrático. Y en ese contexto, ¿qué debería de hacer los Estados Unidos si como resultado de lo que estamos viviendo hoy en día termina con un vecino que no es democrático? Como lo que puede pasar. Adelante. Go ahead, Dave.
Okay. Well, as you know better than me, um, outspoken American comments on Mexican internal affairs can easily backfire. There is a long tradition of Mexican mistrust of the United States. It doesn't always work when American leaders speak out in this way. But what the United States can do is that would be effective is to say, if the Mexican military and police are evolving in ways that are not consistent with democratic ideals, there really should be a limit on the kind of resources and technologies that are made available to repressive instruments of repression inside Mexico. That would be one place to start. And there should be, and we as a society, and I can say this just as individuals, we need to be very conscious of the people-to-people ties and the relationships because of the mass migration since 1970. The United States and Mexico are bound more closely together on the human level than ever before. And so we have traditions we have a bad habit in the United States where we identify the Mexican state with often discriminated against Mexican American people. And so it's considered somehow bad form to criticize the Mexican state as an individual because you're somehow insulting the traditions of Mexican Americans who face discrimination inside the United States.
Thank you, David. Lo que dice es que, como saben, hay mucha desconfianza de parte de Estados Unidos hacia México, pues del gobierno mexicano, pero de alguna manera esto ha evolucionado y bueno, se deben de usar la tecnología y los recursos para combatir este tipo de autoritarismos. En primer lugar, como sociedad, la gente es lo más importante. Entonces, cuando tenemos gente migrando hacia Estados Unidos y que México participa en esto, tenemos que tener una alianza entre ambos países para trabajar juntos de la mano, porque esto, o sea, es un problema de ambos países. Pero de alguna manera esto es como un arma de doble filo, porque al mismo tiempo esta parte de discriminación hacia las personas migrantes o mexicanos o latinos, se ve mal que un estadounidense hable mal del Estado de México, ¿no? Como gobierno de México, ¿no? Del gobierno mexicano como un Estado. Entonces es por eso que de alguna manera no se atreven mucho a decir realmente lo que deberían de decir y alzar la voz cuando ven este autoritarismo.
Go ahead, Dave. Pablo, adelante.
Well, David, what can the political opposition in Mexico do in the United States? I'm talking about senators, representatives, congressmen, maybe businessmen, the lobbying groups. Are there any channels of communication that can be explored?
Sí,
voy a traducir, sí. Le pregunto a David que qué puede hacer la oposición política en México en México, la oposición política mexicana en Estados Unidos. ¿Qué puede hacer en Estados Unidos para abrir canales de comunicación? Me estoy refiriendo a senadores, diputados, partidos políticos, incluso hasta empresarios. ¿Qué pueden hacer en Estados Unidos para defender a México? Go ahead, David.
I think, well, to some extent, we're doing this ourselves right this minute. That we are engaged in just such a channel of communication, and we can multiply that by many, many people. we have extraordinarily powerful Spanish language media in the United States that my perception of is that they often see their job as doing publicity for Mexico inside the United States, rather than reporting some of the truths that would galvanize the Mexican American community. It has always been the ambition of maybe some of the worst Mexican leaders to make the Mexican American community a resource for the authoritarians at home. One of the things one ought to be thinking about is, are there ways that Spanish language bilingual media inside the United States can become a resource to galvanize the Mexican American community as a defender of democracy inside Mexico, rather than a supporter of authoritarianism in Mexico to the United States?
That's a fantastic answer. Dani?
Maravillosa. Dice, ya lo estamos haciendo, como ahorita, por ejemplo, y si esto lo multiplicamos por muchísima gente, los medios de habla hispana son una excelente herramienta porque, digamos, se están haciendo publicidad día a día. En Estados Unidos hay muchísimos medios que son bilingües, y esto a la vez galvaniza la relación entre México y Estados Unidos. Tiene que haber comunidades en las que, digamos, que sean defensores de la democracia, en vez de estar dando noticias que promuevan a los gobiernos autoritarios. Más bien tenemos que buscar que galvanicen y defiendan la democracia.
Anything else, Dave?
No, I'll take the next question.
Pablo, you want to go ahead? Or
I think that's I'm done with questions.
if you don't mind, I mean, we're gonna offer microphones to a couple of people that are been asking. I mean, for the opportunity to exchange ideas with you, Dave. If they promise to ask the question in English and then translate this your question into Spanish, please. I have people here asking for microphones. They're gonna speak. They're gonna ask their questions in English, and we'll translate in Spanish their own question. And Danish Patrick will translate David's comments. You wanna go ahead, Eduardo?
Hello, Mr. Frum. Thank you very much for being here. I'm very excited, very pleased to see you here. I have first one question and then a comment. I live in the United States and I have dual citizenship. And so, therefore, I am one of those people who can vote in the U.S. as well as in Mexican elections. About your article that you wrote not long ago, the autocrat next door, I became very, very impressed about the quality of the article and how well you had assessed the situation. So my question to you regarding that is, what are your sources to stay up to date about Mexican politics from the U.S.? Do you talk to Mexican politicians, other analysts? Do you get access to university studies, articles, journals? I don't know. I'm just wondering how do you do it to be so well informed?
Eduardo, tu pregunta en español. Bueno, la pregunta de Eduardo.
Básicamente
adelante.
es, resumiendo, el artículo que escribió él, que se llama El autócrata de al lado, Next Door, me pareció muy, muy bueno y muy preciso, con un diagnóstico muy bueno, lo cual me sorprende de alguien a la distancia. Entonces, mi pregunta es, ¿qué fuentes utiliza él para mantenerse al día sobre la política en México?
Thanks, Eduardo. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, I appreciate the compliment. I like all journalists, I'm as good as the people who talk to me, and I depend very heavily on them. There is an important Mexican intellectual community in the United States, and I read them and listen to them. I try to read a lot of books and not just articles. I'm to sort of get into the deeper sense of how the present connects to the past in Mexico. an enormously important resource, and this is one we're using right now, and that is Twitter. And I am I'm so worried about the future of Twitter, because if you use Twitter well, you find one smart person, and that person is probably connected to 3 or 5 other smart people, and you find someone you think, this person is telling me things I need to know, and then you see who they follow, and you can track communities of knowledge that way. And when Twitter is functioning, which it doesn't do every day, my Spanish is only mediocre, but it has instant translation, so you can read things, and you can read articles in the Mexican press. And you can subscribe very inexpensively to quality Mexican resources like the Reforma newspaper. And so I try to keep up, but when it's time to write, I do deep dives, and then I talk to a lot of people. And leading figures in Mexican life do come through Washington a lot. And once you know the people they know, you can beg and plead to be invited to talk to them and listen to what they have to say. And you get that kind of tactile knowledge that isn't always so easy to do merely online.
Dani?
Sí. Bueno, que aprecia mucho su comentario, que hay muchísima información intelectual. Hay una gran comunidad en Estados Unidos de intelectuales, y él le gusta mucho leer libros, no solo artículos. Bueno, él dice que también usa mucho Twitter, y Twitter te lo conecta, digamos, si lo usas bien, es una gran red de información, porque puedes conectarte con una persona y esa persona está conectada con otras 3, y si sigues, digamos, la trayectoria de esa conexión de personas, puedes tener una gran red de información. Y bueno, él dice que también hay muchos medios que son muy baratos, como el Reforma, en el cual te puedes inscribir, y de ahí también es una gran fuente de información.
Thank you. Anything else, Dan? Dave?
Let's take the next question.
Okay, we have Alberto Fierros. Alberto, your question in English, and then translate your own question into Spanish. Thank you.
Yes, for sure. Well, David, thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. But back to the root of the conversation, my question is, how do you see the future of democracy in Mexico when the party of the left is becoming stronger and stronger every day?
Ahora, en español.
Yeah.
Sorry. Bueno, mi pregunta es cómo ve la democracia en México cuando el partido, pues, que digamos que de izquierda está en el poder, se vuelve un poquito más fuerte día con día, a pesar de muchos esfuerzos de mexicanos como nosotros.
Now, Dave, is yours.
Okay, yeah. Well, not to quibble, I don't know that I would call Morena a party of the left. I mean, we do it all the time in our reporting, but where are the universal social programs? Where is the aid to businesses and individuals during the COVID pandemic? I mean, I'm sure you've seen the charts about how much less Mexico spent to help people through COVID than Brazil did. Where is the activist state? That this is a personalist state. It's an authoritarian state. It certainly denounces the wealthy, but what does it do for the poor? What has it done to expand opportunity? How are the schools better? I mean, I think the one thing that Lopez Obrador is not is a kind of conventional social democrat. He's not interested in building structures of redistribution. And many of his closest political allies are some of the very wealthiest people in Mexico. And he is using protectionist measures to exclude competition that would lower prices and benefit ordinary people. My understanding is that Mexicans pay some of the highest prices in the world for their cell phone services because the competition next door is excluded, and the person who has become enormously rich because he has an uncompetitive cell phone market is one of the most important allies of the supposedly left-wing President Lopez Obrador.
It's true.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Dan?
Sí. Bueno, él no llamaría a Morena como un partido de izquierda, más bien pregunta, bueno, si fuera de izquierda, ¿Dónde están los valores universales? ¿Dónde está el manejo contra la pandemia y el COVID? Como, digamos, compara a México con Brasil en ese sentido. ¿Dónde está el Estado de Derecho? Y él más bien lo ve como un partido autoritario, donde no hay oportunidades. ¿Dónde está la educación? ¿Dónde están las escuelas? Habla mucho de la pobreza, sin embargo, critica mucho al, ¿cómo se llama? A la gente rica, pero se deja a los pobres completamente abandonados, ¿no? Entonces él dice que no es un partido de izquierda, excluye completamente a la competencia, da como ejemplo, bueno, él se rodea de gente rica, pero por ejemplo no da oportunidad para inversión o para competencia. En México, por ejemplo, es de los países que más pagamos por servicio de celular. Cuando tenemos, bueno, él no lo quiso decir, pero yo lo voy a decir, a Slim, que es un aliado del régimen, ¿no? Entonces, por eso no hay competencia. Gracias.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to welcome Jorge Guajardo, which is here. Jorge, you wanna make a question today?
Thank you for the opportunity, and I'd be glad to. And David, thank you for doing these spaces with the Mexican community. Just a quick question. I've read your both of your books on President Trump and his style of authoritarianism, and I see a lot of coincidence with Mexican President López Obrador. I see them as being identical, and yet I see Biden presidency doing everything to change course in the United States from what they see as the past of Trump, and yet willing to condone everything that a Trump would do in Mexico. United States in its foreign policy as pertains to this new type of authoritarianism.
Yes. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the Biden administration has made Mexican policy a low priority. It has maintained a lot of continuity with the Trump policy. President Biden wants the frontier to be quiet, migration to be slowed. Lopez Obrador is willing to deliver that. And that has been Biden's priority. And my guess is, as with any pressure that you try to suppress, the pressure explodes. And my own fear is that we are heading to a real crisis in Mexico in 2024. That is the election will look unfair. It will look unfree. There will be violence, and it will be hard for Americans to look away. And Biden may be confronted some months before the election, and with trouble. And meanwhile, he's going to have a lot of Republicans speaking in the reckless, irresponsible, dangerous way that I've spoken about, urging some kind of American military response to the fentanyl problem, firing rockets into fentanyl labs, or even sending raids of troops. And they will say, with Mexican cooperation if we can, but without if we can't. Well, what is it called when you send troops into a country without that country's permission? That's an invasion.
Exactly.
Sí, dice que hay muchas similitudes entre Trump y López Obrador. Bueno, Biden realmente su prioridad es la migración, ¿no? Y López Obrador está dispuesto a obedecer y a quedarse callado siempre y cuando lo dejen hacer lo que quiera con el crimen organizado. Va a haber mucha presión. Dice que 2024 va a explotar esto, o sea, bueno, no explotar en el sentido de la palabra, de que esta presión va a explotar y va a haber una gran crisis en 2024. Va a haber violencia, va a haber pues muchos abusos de poder, y que Estados Unidos no va a poder seguir haciéndose de la vista gorda. Biden va a tener va a ser confrontado. Obviamente Trump y los republicanos van a aprovechar esto para pedir que se actúe, que se metan a Estados Unidos, a México con armamentos, con bombas, con todo, y obviamente esto es una invasión.
So next question we have Daniel Muñoz. Again, if you do your question in English and then translating in Spanish. Thank you.
Sure, Sociedad. Thanks for the mic. Pablo, good to hear you as always. I've been expecting this space for a while. David, I'm quite interested in your perspective of what I perceive as a sort of another new axis of evil, in form of illiberal autocrats and other authoritarian leaders in the world, either left-wing or right-wing, that backpedal civil liberties and steamroll through democratic institutions and checks and balances. What I am most concerned is the increasing polarizing climate in politics, the lack of consensus, and even the will to build it. With this climate being spearheaded by authoritarian leaders such as Trump, our AMLO, Erdogan, or Orban. My question to you, as you're someone that rejects authoritarianism, how can we turn down the political temperature, create basic great consensus, general things we can all agree upon, either center-left or center-right, and build upon our institutions and freedoms that civil society has fought for decades across the borders? That's the question, Sociedad. Thank you.
In Spanish.
En español.
Sí.
Well, I think that the question is very astute, that authoritarian personalities around the world have watched each other and copied each other. Orban, Erdogan, Lopez Obrador, Bolsonaro, and now Lula, unfortunately, following in his footsteps. They look at they study each other's methods, and they learn what works and what doesn't work. And one of the reasons they do this, I want to point to something that is a really positive thing about our modern world that we don't give enough credit to. And this is one of the reasons we have this new kind of authoritarianism, which is because it is much more difficult for authoritarian and much more hazardous for authoritarian leaders to use outright violence on a large scale than they used to do. I mean, Vladimir Putin is doing it now, of course, but modern authoritarianism is much more economical with violence than old school authoritarianism was. And partly because of media, partly because there is more of a global community, partly because you do not want to be cut off from institutions of international trade and finance. Viktor Orban, for example, Hungary is in the European Union. Hungary is subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, and it doesn't want to be kicked out. Mexico is a partner in NAFTA. There are things that a Mexican government, if a Mexican government did what happened in Tlatelolco in 1968, that would have, I think, real investment ramifications, all kinds of ramifications that Mexican governments would want to, that a Mexican leader, no matter how authoritarian, would want to avoid. And so the reason that there are similarities, they face similar constraints, and one of them is the constraint against large-scale, visible, state-directed violence. And that is a tremendously positive thing about our modern world. And that so someone as thuggish as Erdogan, he pushes people into exile, but they're usually allowed to take their property. He certainly doesn't kill people. He doesn't put people in concentration camps. And this is a good thing. This is what they study from each other. And these are resources for all of us. We live in a world where people are more connected, people are more educated, people have a stronger sense of what is expected and what is not, and where, by the way, democratic societies have delivered proof of concept. You know, back in the heyday of the old kind of authoritarianism in the 1930s, liberalism and democracy, they looked like losers, not only losers in terms of their ability to mobilize force, but their ability to deliver standards of living. I think everyone around the world sees that life in the European Union, life in the United States, life in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, that this has a lot to offer. People want to choose it in a way that these countries didn't seem to have so much to offer in, say, 1936 or 1937. So one thing that is a resource to use is to understand that the regime is inhibited in its ability to direct visible violence. And one of the things that makes Mexico such a scary example of modern authoritarianism, and one of is, and I do not know enough about this to know how conscious Lopez Obrador is of this, is you have a lot of violence in Mexico that is committed by non-state actors who have relationships to state institutions, and the state can then either knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or not, withdraw protection and indicate that certain people. And I think this is what happened to the broadcaster I interviewed, Gomez Leva, who was attacked in the center of Mexico City, presumably by criminals, presumably not with any permission from the authorities, but after the president spoke about him in a way that indicated he was vulnerable. Protection had been withdrawn. And I'm sorry, I'm speaking too long for the translator here, who may want to summarize my remarks. But
okay, thank you.
But there are rules and taboos about the use of state-directed violence, and this is a tremendously powerful fact about modern authoritarianism.
Danish?
Sí, bueno, lo que dice es que...
Feel free to abridge.
That's okay.
Yes.
Bueno, voy a resumir que básicamente que tenemos una gran herramienta a nuestro favor, que es que las dictaduras de hoy en día ya no usan la fuerza o la violencia como lo hacían en 1930, 1950, 60 y tantos, porque hay demasiada, ¿cómo se llama? Estamos conectados con el mundo entero, ¿no? Hoy en día la Unión Europea también, estos países como México quieren pertenecer al intercambio económico que existe con la Unión Europea, con Estados Unidos, con Australia, con todos estos países que eran ejemplos de democracia, tienen ciertos beneficios, y hoy en día el estar, digamos, el ejercer la violencia así cruda, directa, está muy mal visto, no lo pueden hacer directamente. Entonces a lo mejor usan pues lo que hemos visto, ¿no? Los famosos porros, él no lo dijo así, pero yo lo digo, o indirectamente manda gente para que haya violencia, pero él, una de dos, o no lo manda el gobierno, o sea, el dictador, pero o simplemente se retrae de ejercer la protección hacia los ciudadanos, que es lo que vimos con Ciro Gómez Leiva, el ejemplo, ¿no?
Yeah. You want to follow on this, Dave?
No, I'll pause and take the question.
Oye, Gabriel, ¿puedo hacer una pregunta?
Adelante.
So, David, you're a former conventional Republican, or maybe sort of traditional conservative, and you already outlined what a proper social democratic leftist government would look like. So my question is, what's the future of conservatism? How should a conservative democratic government look like in the 21st century that is not aligned with populism? Voy a traducir. Mi pregunta a David Frum es ¿cuál es el futuro de la derecha? Ya dejó claro cuál es más o menos el semblante de una izquierda moderna, pero ahora me gustaría saber, él siendo conservador, o habiendo sido conservador, republicano tradicional, ¿qué le depara a la derecha democrática? Please.
Yes. Well, maybe it's just because I'm getting old, but I increasingly think that societies need both their left and their right, and that each has something to contribute. And that is especially true with societies that are moving toward development, like Mexico. I think the things I would have said in 1985 about free trade and the need to fight against monopolization of the economy, and the need for dynamic and competitive enterprise economy, the danger of economic controls of any kind, of controls on rents or controls on profits. I think all of those things are a tremendously powerful resource. I think one of the things I have changed my mind about to some degree is that while all of that is true, and those are great contributions that the right has to make, that the left has important contributions as well. You need universal systems of education. You need universal systems of health provision. You need some measure of social insurance. You need effective tax collection. That taxes not just those who are vulnerable to taxation, but that taxes the wealth where it is found. And I think a lot of our debates about left and right in fully developed countries are not really applicable to countries that are moving toward development.
Sí, bueno, dice que él ha cambiado mucho su postura en los años, durante los años, porque ahora, digamos que tanto la izquierda como la derecha se necesitan hoy en día en una sociedad donde el desarrollo es importantísimo, y en países como México. Él dice que en 1985 él hubiera impulsado bueno, hubiera atacado, por ejemplo, el monopolio, pero hoy en día se necesita recursos poderosos para contribuciones de sistemas universales de educación, para impuestos, para de gobierno, etcétera. Entonces, ya es tan importante la izquierda como la derecha.
Yeah, thank you. You want to follow, Dave?
I do want to follow. So the question is, what is the future of conservatism? I can intellectually give you both predictions, not all of them so cheerful, and wishes, which are more cheerful. But the question that seems to me much more excites and moves me is, how do we stabilize democracy after this 20-year period where it seems to have been going backwards? And how do we stabilize it for more and more of the world? And then I would say there are things that the tradition I grew up in has to offer, and there are things that the tradition I did not grow up in also has to offer. And to me, the exciting question is, I think we need to move beyond. I'm in my 60s now. We need to move beyond the debates we had when I was in my 20s. Politics, the questions always change. And we have been in a period where democratic and liberal ideals, constitutional ideals, have been in retreat. They need to go in advance. And that's one of the reasons I think this conflict in Ukraine is so important. And let me pause here, and I want to say something about that, because I know Mexico is at some remove from that conflict.
Pablo?
No.
Yeah, okay. Let the translator go to work. I want to say something more.
Okay. Dani?
Okay. Él dice que, bueno, Pablo pregunta que cómo se puede, cuál era su fórmula para una postura conservadora equilibrada, ¿no? Y bueno, esa es la interpretación. Y él dice que ya estamos en otro momento, que la política avanza, evoluciona, y lo más importante es, lo más emocionante es que tenemos que avanzar. Ya no podemos estar como era la política antes. O sea, vemos como lo que está pasando en Ucrania, y que eso es un gran ejemplo de cómo está avanzando la postura conservadora, que ya se están estabilizando, digamos, cada día más. Es muy emocionante para él, y que siempre hay que estar en un constante cambio.
De ahí va adelante. Go ahead.
The significance of Ukraine, and I know Mexico is neutral, and your president is sympathetic to Russia, and you're not directly involved. But the reason this conflict is so important to the whole democratic world is critics of liberalism and democracy, whether they're on the left or on the right, whether they're religious or secular, they say the same thing. They say you are divided, you are weak, you are boring, you are procedural. You cannot act. We are powerful. We are the future. We have knowledge. You have disagreements. You let people deny God. You let men dress like women. You let people make mistakes with their lives. You let them smoke or drink if they want to. You let the rich get rich, and you let the poor get poor, and you're just a mess. And this happens this line of criticism gets heard once a generation. And then there's a crisis. And then what you discover is, yes, all of those things look true, but when you really put democratic societies to the test, they're enormously strong. People will give their lives for these ideals. People will cooperate across borders for these ideals. And I think that it's not just Vladimir Putin who's getting the shock of his life, but the cooperation among many different countries to support Ukraine. It's a shock of the life to everyone. And the reason why would-be authoritarians, whether it's Modi, whether it's Lopez Obrador, whether it's the South African regime, that they are instinctively against Ukraine is because they're seeing we hear this is a test of cooperation and power. And their criticism of liberal regimes is that they are weak.
La democracia dice que siempre está cambiante, ¿no? Que es un ciclo completo. Digamos que estamos divididos, ¿no? La gente que cree en democracia son aburridos, son como quien dice los nerds, ¿no? En cambio, bueno, deja que no haya Dios, que no haya, que los hombres se vistan como mujer, que fumen, que se casen entre personas del mismo sexo, etcétera. Y luego los ricos se hacen más ricos, los pobres se hacen más pobres. Y luego hay una línea de criticismo, de crítica, ¿no? Y esta línea, digamos, lleva a una gran crisis. Y esta crisis lleva a un despertar, digamos, y es lo que, digamos que la gente se da la vida por defender sus ideales. Eso es lo más importante. Entonces, lo más importante es que evoluciona la democracia. Estos países, hay una cooperación de países para defender, por ejemplo, Ucrania, ¿no? Y esto es lo que los países autoritarios están en contra de Ucrania porque no pueden entender que haya esta como sociedad o cooperación entre países para defender un ideal.
Anything else, Dave?
I'll take the next question.
Okay. Delo, again, your question in English and then in Spanish, please.
Sí, gracias, Gabriel. Buenas tardes a todos. Hi, David. I have two questions. You said that the United States has the best army equipment. And my first question will be why you haven't been able to control it. The next question will be the United States have blocked Cuba and now Venezuela for all this socialism. Would they consider to block Mexico if they win on the 24th? Mi pregunta es que él dijo que tienen el mejor armamento para guerra en Estados Unidos. Le pregunto que por qué no han podido controlarlo. Se me va el aire. Y la segunda pregunta es que ya bloquearon el comercio con Cuba y con Venezuela. Si gana el socialismo en el 24, lo considerarían con México.
Okay. These are both very powerful questions. I'll try to answer both. As the first, it is, I'm going to tell you what you already know yourself. We do not control guns because of the dysfunctions in our political system, which exist as they do in the Mexican system. It's a shame and it's a scandal, and it's something for which so many American families suffer in blood and grief. We don't control the guns here. We don't protect our children. And of course, we export them to neighbors, and the neighbors suffer as we inflict suffering on ourselves. So what can I say about this that you don't already know? It's a national shame. It's a national scandal. But that's not, I mean, it's not exactly military equipment. It should be military equipment, but unfortunately, it's also civilian equipment. And this is one of our griefs and shames. Let me pause there and let the translator take that, and then I'll answer the question about Venezuela and Cuba.
Ok, la primera pregunta es de que no controlamos las armas por la misma razón que no se controlan tampoco en México, ¿no? Vemos las matanzas en escuelas y a niños y es verdaderamente un escándalo y es una vergüenza nacional. Ellos pues se sienten muy, muy apenados por esto, ¿no? Y no es necesariamente no son armas únicamente militares, sino que también son civiles.
Dave?
Okay. And the second question about Cuba, Venezuela, and Mexico. I don't believe that, and again, you will all know better, but my reading of Lopez Obrador and Morena is they are not exactly a socialist movement or even really exactly a left-wing movement. They're a personalist movement. And that in many ways they protect the existing distribution of property and wealth in Mexico. They don't criticize it. And Lopez Obrador and Morena have been very respectful of, and maybe even too much so, of American red lines and American property interests and NAFTA property interests. So I don't think you're going to see that. But what I do worry about, and this is more like Venezuela than like Cuba, is that the Mexican state could lose control over large parts of Mexican territory, and criminal organizations could become a kind of parallel or even substitute government. And the writ of the Mexican government will just stop running over big parts of Mexico.
Ok, no cree que Morena o López Obrador son socialistas ni de izquierda, más bien es un movimiento personalista. Y él dice que realmente están, es una repartición de riqueza. O sea, realmente no es que tienen mucho que perder, digamos, porque hay mucha propiedad en Estados Unidos. Entonces respetan mucho eso, a diferencia de Cuba y Venezuela. México, por ejemplo, si sigue así, sí podría ser, el crimen organizado podría ser un gobierno paralelo al gobierno, ¿no? Manejando el crimen organizado, y sí, esto podría ser muy peligroso para México.
Thank you. Anything else? We move to the next one.
Yeah. So, and when I say that I worry about the decline of state authority, I don't mean this just, I said territory, but I don't just mean territory and land. I mean, I wonder if the Mexican state completely controls all of Mexico City, or whether there are parts of Mexico City that are penetrated by organized crime in a way where the Mexican government just doesn't have authority there either. And there are parts of the Mexican government that the Mexican government doesn't itself control, and where criminality and state intermingle. This is, I think, very much what happened in Venezuela, where it just became just such a dangerous country for anyone who wanted to lead a normal, law-abiding life. But I don't see, I worry about chaos in Mexico. I don't worry about a socialist takeover leading to sanctions and hostile relations, but I do worry about a breakdown of the authority of the state.
Él dice que, bueno, en términos de territorio, el Estado básicamente está penetrado por el crimen organizado. Entonces, lo que más le preocupa a él es que el gobierno no controle al crimen organizado. La criminalidad y el Estado se mezclan, o sea, se lleguen a mezclar y sean uno mismo, digamos. O se use la fuerza para gobernar, ¿no? Lo más peligroso, dice él, no le preocupa tanto que haya una intervención como Cuba y Venezuela, sino más bien que nos convertamos en un país donde el crimen organizado esté completamente gobierne y estemos fuera de control, o sea, que no haya un gobierno que realmente ponga orden.
Estado fallido. Anything else, Dave, or we move to the next one?
Let's move.
Okay, Nacho, again, a very short question, please, Nacho, in English and then in Spanish, please.
Okay. I have news for you, Mr. Frum. In Mexico, maybe 30 or 40% of the territory is right now belong to the criminals, the different cartels we have in Mexico. And one of the questions you say about President Lopez Obrador is respecting the property of the U.S. Citizen in Mexico. That is the problem for, the problem we have with U.S. They only thinking in his business. And while nobody touch his business, no problem is that that's authority destroy the country. And hopefully, I think U.S. need a strong Mexico as Mexico needs U.S. So that's the problem. The politician and the businessmen in U.S. need to look what happened in Mexico, because if this administration win in 2024, it will be millions of Mexicans try to leave to U.S. And that is a fact. Thanks.
Ahora en español. Pero breve.
Ok, si quieres, ¿se leo en español?
Sí, en español breve
Okay.
para la audiencia.
Ok, lo que le estoy preguntando, señor, es que le tengo noticias. Actualmente en México, un 30 o 40% del territorio está controlado por el crimen organizado, y el problema que tenemos muchos mexicanos es que los Estados Unidos siempre ven por sus negocios, por las propiedades de que sus ciudadanos que tienen negocios en México los respeta este gobierno, y no les importa que si eso pase, aunque esté destruyendo al país. Entonces, eso es lo que le comenté, y que si no ponen atención a lo que está haciendo el gobierno de López Obrador en México y vuelven a ganar en el 2024, millones de mexicanos van a tratar de irse a vivir a Estados Unidos.
Gracias, Dan. Gracias. Dave?
Yeah. No, I feel the power of that question. I was very intensely involved with the debates over U.S.-Canada free trade and then NAFTA, and then I worked on preparing the reception at the White House for President Vicente Fox in September 2001, and I remember seeing him on the South Lawn of the White House in September 2001. And if you'd asked me in 1994 or even in 2001, what do you think Mexico will look like when you are 75 years old, David? I would have said, I think it'll be close to being a fully developed country by then. It'll look like Portugal. It'll look like Sicily. Look like Greece. It'll be close. It won't be as rich as Paris, but it will be close to being a fully developed country. And I think they're on the trajectory. I think they've made the right kinds of decisions. I think they're on the way to that. And I many of the people on this call may remember those days and may remember those feelings that Mexico in the 2030s will look like Portugal, look like Greece, look like Sicily, a little poorer than the United States, but basically a developed country. And all the ingredients were there if the right decisions had been made, if the investments in education had been made, the investments in human capital, the investments in transportation infrastructure. And that's clearly not going to happen. And it's maddening. And the fact that the United States is blind to what a tremendous benefit to the United States it would be to have a fully developed Mexico. I grew up in Canada. I try. The idea that Canada and the United States, Canada is a much smaller country than Mexico, obviously. Canada and the United States have their two sovereignties, but they're an economic space. And they're a cultural zone, and people move back and forth freely, and there are approximately equal numbers of Americans living in Canada and Canadians living in the United States. And it's just not an issue. What that could be, and what we don't have, and how, in a way, the lack of ambition of American policy for Mexico, and in some ways the lack of ambition of the Mexican elite for themselves. These are heartbreaking things, and not what I would have expected in 1994 or 2001 if I'd been asked to forecast the history of the future of the 2030s.
So sad to hear that. Dice que es una pregunta muy poderosa y él ha estado muy involucrado en todo esto, en la Casa Blanca, y participó en muchas otras cosas. Dice que si esta pregunta se la hubieran hecho en 1994, inclusive en el 2001, le hubieran preguntado, ¿cómo ves a México? Su respuesta era, es un país desarrollado como Sicilia, como Grecia, todavía no como Estados Unidos, pero es un país rico, con riqueza, con capital, con oportunidades, ¿no? Todo esto tiene todos los ingredientes para hacerlo, ¿no? La inversión en educación, en capital, en política, todo. Pero ya no lo ve así. Desgraciadamente todo esto cambió y lo triste es que Estados Unidos no lo quiere ver, ¿no? No quiere ver el beneficio que sería tener un país vecino en desarrollo que fuera como Sicilia, como Grecia, como un país en desarrollo que está casi a la altura de Estados Unidos. Y bueno, y no lo es hoy en día, tristemente. Él nació en Canadá y bueno, vive en Estados Unidos. Y él se mueve de Estados Unidos a Canadá y dice, no se siente la diferencia entre un país y otro. Yo puedo ir y venir y no hay ninguna diferencia. O sea, es prácticamente lo mismo.
I seem to have lost this.
Sorry, Dave?
I seem to have lost you. I'm sorry.
I'm here. I'm still.
No, she's speaking.
Y dice que esta falta de ambición, tanto de Estados Unidos, de tener un vecino con esta potencialidad de ser un país desarrollado, no lo está viendo, y también de México, de no tener esa ambición de llegar a hacer esto, ¿no? Entonces, para él, dice que le rompe el corazón, ¿no? Que es muy, muy triste.
Danish, ya a lo mejor tienes que salir y entrar porque él no te escucha. Si sales, vuelves a pedir el micrófono y te subo. ¿Te parece bien?
Sí.
Okay. So anything else, or we move to the next one? Okay.
Let's move.
Okay. We have Art Gallardo. Again, your question in English and then in Spanish.
Hi, Gabe. And you hear me, right?
Yeah,
yes, I hear it.
Okay, awesome. Well, this is, I feel like I'm a kid in a candy store because this is amazing having David Frum, Pablo Macluf, José Antonio Crespo, que se me perdió por ahí. This is amazing. So, anyway, this is a great effort. So thank you again, Sociedad, because this is really, really, really good. Well, and actually, Pablo addressed, these issues. So I'll just try to dig a little deeper into this because I think he was right on a couple of things. And one of the, I really feel that conservatives in the U.S. and in Mexico hold a very important piece of the solutions for both countries. And we have some big issues that overlap. The obvious ones that come up in the U.S. all the time. I currently reside in Texas, so like assault style weapons, drugs, immigration, etc. But there are so many more things. Trade, as you were mentioning, in your previous answer. So and as Pablo mentioned, like the elections are coming up, both are going to overlap. Mexico is bound to be the political piñata here, and to some extent, also the U.S. is gonna take some heat in Mexico, maybe not as much, but. David, you mentioned this, but I actually, in the way that Pablo asked that question about the the lobby and maybe some industry people, etc. Yeah, influencing the what happens in the U.S. I'm a bit more interested in what is that you think that just voters, conservative voters, I don't know, like the mom and pop shop owners, everyday Americans might need to really see the benefits that would bring to have a partner that would be more developed in the case of Mexico. What needs to happen so people here in the U.S. Really get that is in their best interest? And what happens while we have domestic agendas both in Mexico and the U.S. We have areas where we can do a lot of progress. What do you think that needs to happen here in the U.S. with those voters so they put some pressure on the political leadership and which frankly I'm really disappointed in their lack of imagination for solutions, to many issues, like, but especially when it comes to not only renewables but immigration and the gun violence we're suffering here, which could really benefit Mexico should, like, the assault weapons situation here would improve, and we would take drug addictions as a more of a social a social health issue. My God, my terms crossed there. So I don't even know how I'm going to translate that, sociedad, but
Échate la
I might need
corta,
an assist.
échate la corta.
I know, no, but that's the question, David. What do you think that voters here need to see so they get it, so they get that, that something needs to happen in some of these issues where both countries can benefit and could be a win-win?
Well, go ahead.
Wow. So,
Dale, que de hecho es échate
bueno,
la corta, pero en una muy
sí,
corta, ¿verdad? Por
como
tanto
que
rollo. Ahora
resumiendo, ¿no? Es que lo batallo para aterrizar. La pregunta, ¿qué se necesita para que los votantes en Estados Unidos, los conservadores, entiendan que es en su mejor interés que los temas comunes que tenemos en México y en Estados Unidos, como son las armas de estilo militar, la guerra de las drogas, la inmigración, la energía renovable? ¿Qué se necesita para que los conservadores acá vean que esos temas son importantes y que puedan poner algo de influencia en los políticos de este lado, y que haya ya movimiento más concreto? Si te lo pude resumir, hizo lo mejor que pude.
perfecto,
Gracias, chavos.
Gracias.
Well,
David, you have the answer. I will vote for you.
Okay. Well, when you talk about win-win, I mean, when you look at the Sonoran Desert, which seems so useless, I think we're looking at what is potentially the vastest solar plantation on Earth. Because unlike the Sahara Desert, which is far from markets, here you have this vast area of sun collection that's close to Los Angeles, close to San Diego, close to the factories of Monterey, close to Texas. I mean, that our children, I hope, will live to see a world in which that useless land is covered with reflectors that are generating power for the American Southwest and the Mexican North, and those are but right now, this is a thing I learned when I was down in Mexico reporting for the story I wrote. There's about $5 billion of Canadian investment in building solar plants in the Sonoran Desert that cannot be connected to the Mexican grid, because Lopez Obrador decreed that in some year that was important to him, some percentage of Mexican electricity was generated by Mexican-owned resources. And that percentage in that year, whatever it was, whenever year he had his first kiss of the prom or whatever it was, that's like the Bible to him. And so the Canadian solar plantation can't be linked to the Mexican grid because it would push foreign ownership of Mexican electricity production over this magical percentage of when he was young and had his first kiss. It's crazy. It's just crazy. What do you do to the American voter? Well, one of the things that when you speak about the mom and pop American voter, important to keep in mind, the Republican Party is becoming steadily more of a Mexican party. That one of the great strategic changes in American politics is that Hispanic Americans generally, and Mexican Americans specifically, are moving into the Republican Party, even as Anglo-Americans are moving out of the Republican Party once they or their children or their grandchildren get educated. So I think one of the this is a long answer, but I think one of the questions, and this is a question I would have, I don't have the answer, I will turn it back to you, is a lot of Mexican-American voters are people who've turned their back on Mexico and say, I never want to think about that country again. And how do you get Mexican-Americans to say, I want to think about the country, I want to care about the country, I want to liberalize the country, I want to make the country I left be more like a country I could return to?
That's a good answer. Dan?
Es una situación de ganar. Dice, el desierto de Sonora, por ejemplo, es tan vasto, es un territorio que es perfecto para una granja de paneles solares. Está tan cerca de Texas, de Monterrey, de California, o sea, es estratégicamente bien ubicado, ¿no? Pero es una tierra sin uso. Sin embargo, bueno, hay 5 billones de dólares canadienses que se están invirtiendo en estas granjas de paneles solares. Sin embargo, López Obrador no quiere que se diga que se está invirtiendo ahí porque ahí me perdí un poquito, creo que es donde él...
Porque quiere que la energía la genere el operador mexicano,
Ajá.
que es la CFE.
Uh-huh. Entonces, es una tristeza porque se está perdiendo toda esta gran oportunidad de inversión y donde todos los otros países, tanto México como Estados Unidos y Canadá, se verían beneficiados, ¿no? El Partido Republicano se está volviendo el votante mexicano. Digamos que los hispanos o los mexicanos que viven en Estados Unidos se están yendo al Partido Republicano y viceversa, los anglosajones o de habla inglesa se van al Partido Democrático. Los votantes le están dando la vuelta a los mexicanos. Entonces él pregunta, ¿qué quiero yo para el país que yo dejé? O sea, para las personas que migran a Estados Unidos, ¿no? ¿Qué quisiera yo para el país que yo dejé? ¿Qué quisiera yo aportar o qué quisiera yo regresarle? O cuando yo regrese, ¿qué es lo que me gustaría que ese país fuera?
You want to make a follow on this?
No, I'll take the next question.
Okay. We have Consigliere Miguel.
Hi, hello. Thank you for the space, as always, Gabriel. David, it has been really interesting to listen to all the comments. We are an NGO based on the sovereign state of Quebec. Being a Canadian, you will understand the reference. And I'm really mad that we haven't talked about Quebec in the equation. But getting to serious matters, I'm worried. I keep hearing people trying to interpret a situation, what we are going through with old paradigms. I believe that the left and right concepts that we have are maybe outdated. Well, I think that they are outdated. Nowadays, the rules of engagement have changed. As a matter of fact, what we are seeing in the States with the new incitatus in the figure of Donald Trump running for president while he has been already charged, may, from my point of view, may indicate that we are really seeing the end of the Cold War and a time of inflection. These classes, this interpretation of the world that we are trying to use is probably not allowing us to understand what is the problem to be solved. I lived some time in Arizona, and I remember I was there during the 9/11, and what I have seen in the last 20 years is like a snowball. People are afraid. I would say most of the voters in the States, and they are trying to go to old values. Everybody's trying to get back to the best period in their lives, and I think that that's what is going through. Also, it's going on in Mexico as well. AMLO certainly is not left. He is pre. He's trying to govern under the pre-paradigm. He is trying to bring back what worked in the 70s, what he saw the pre was doing in the 70s. The problem is that nowadays the world has changed. Climate change will change everything, and that's in general the sensation that I have, that we are misunderstanding, we are misreading the signs, and therefore we are not being able to understand and analyze what's going on. All of this to say that the key question is, how can we avoid a conflict between Mexico and the United States, and how can we manage to bring populations in Canada, in the States, and Mexico to work together as a region? I think that the vocation, the only way to get out of this is to integrate the region in order to ensure better competition. I don't know, what do you think on this? En español, sorry, if you want me to...
Dale.
En español, I will do the short version. I think, creo que estamos interpretando, estamos usando paradigmas que ya no funcionan, en la derecha, la izquierda, corresponden a formas de ver el mundo y tratar de comprenderlo del siglo pasado. Cambio climático nos impone una nueva realidad y necesitamos entender qué es lo que sucede para poder arreglar el problema. Y al final del día necesitamos ver cómo podemos integrar la región, Canadá, Estados Unidos, México, para que podamos ser competitivos en el ambiente en el que estamos en el día de hoy. That in a nutshell. Quedo escuchando.
Gracias. Thank you.
Well, that was a very rich message, and let me say two things about it. One is sort of a semi-joke, and then I'll take a serious point. So the caller, the participant joined from the Canadian province of Quebec, which he called the sovereign nation of Quebec. And that's a funny joke. I'm from Canada originally, so I understand this. That Quebec is the French-speaking province in Canada. And there's a famous joke when an exasperated person said, "What do Quebecers want? Canada's a pretty good country. What do you want?" And the answer is, what we want is an independent Quebec within a united Canada. Which sounds contradictory, but you know what? The modern economy said, what do I want? I would like sushi delivered to my house in 30 minutes. And capitalism says, okay, if you want that, we'll deliver it. Like the customer choice. There are things that people want, and the answer is not to tell them they're stupid. The answer is to say, well, how do we figure this out? You know, the terrible Irish problem. We all grew up with this, watching terrible terrorism divide this tiny little island with so few million people. And what was the solution? Is in Northern Ireland, the part of the island of Ireland that was contested, everybody got both an Irish passport and a British passport. You're both Irish and British. To which the answer is, well, that doesn't make any sense. Yes, it does. It works. It solved the problem. And you can believe you're Irish if you want to. You can believe you're British if you want to. And then until Brexit, the border disappeared and people moved back and forth. And there are people who lived in Northern Ireland who identified as Irish, and there are people who lived in Northern Ireland who identified as British, and they might be next door, and they didn't kill each other. And so these are the kinds of creative solutions I think we all need to find. Now, very profoundly, the question about AMLO not being left being a man of the pre. I had, when I was reporting on Mexican politics, I had a long conversation with one of the distinguished pollsters in Mexico. And I'm sorry for the translator, this answer is long. And I said, tell me about the AMLO voter. Who is the core AMLO voter? This pollster said, a man in his 50s or 60s, not university educated, not living in a big city, who regrets the past. It's a Trump voter.
Exactly.
It's a Trump voter. It's the same person in a different country.
So true.
¿Y lo traduzco?
Sí.
Ok, bueno, él dice que es una pregunta bastante extensa y que lo va a responder en dos preguntas. Una que es como broma, porque él también es de Quebec, y dice que es una provincia francesa en Canadá, y dice, ¿qué es lo que quieren los quebecuas? Quieren un Quebec independiente, pero lo quieren que esté integrado a Canadá. Esa es la broma, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, dices, es muy fácil, es cómo lo resolvemos. Pues es como Irlanda, él da el ejemplo de Irlanda. Al sur de Irlanda existe una provincia donde también se querían independizar. Entonces, no sabían cómo resolverlo hasta que se les ocurrió sacar un pasaporte irlandés y otro británico. Entonces, así de fácil. El que quiere creer que es británico, cree que es de Inglaterra, y el que quiere creer que es irlandés, es irlandés. Van y vienen, no hay ninguna frontera, no tienen que pasar ningún tipo de aduana, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, es un tipo de solución creativa. Y bueno, la segunda pregunta, que no es tan chistosa, es la de AMLO. ¿Quién es el votante de López? Es un hombre o mujer de 50, 60 años que no tiene educación y que básicamente está resentido con el pasado. Entonces digamos, DNA de este quebecuá pero en otro territorio, ¿no? En otro.
Y es un
¿Me permite hacer una precisión?
Adelante.
No es tanto que esté resentido, es que sueña con el pasado.
Y dice él, es un votador es un votante de Trump.
No, son los mismos perfiles y ahí podemos hacer el parangón entre lo que sucede, que es el votante de más de 50 años, que no está educado, que vive en la provincia, en el interior del país, que es el mismo perfil del votante de AMLO, y yo agregaría, es el mismo perfil del votante de este amigo de Brasil y de Putin en Rusia.
Do you agree with that? I mean, that it will be the same voter profile for Bolsonaro
and Putin,
and Putin, the same one that votes for Trump.
I think that the thing here is that there are people that they are dreaming of the glories of the past, and they want to bring the certainty of what they experienced when they were young.
I understood the question. I have enough Spanish to understand that. Putin, I think, is more exotic because Putin is more like a classic dictator than an authoritarian populist. Because the authoritarian populist does mobilize some kind of consent, which I think Putin probably lost about 2011. But I think it is true everywhere, maybe in all democracies and semi-democracies, that there's a question between people who say, I want the good old days, and people who say, I like the bad new days.
David, we are planning to I mean, it's already 6:47 in Washington, D.C., and I know it's Friday.
Yes, so I have to go in a minute.
Yeah, but we have still a couple of questions from two guys that are here with microphones. So if you don't mind, we attend these two and then we close. It's fine?
Okay. Very good.
Okay, Rogelio, in English and then Spanish.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thanks, David. I really appreciated your perspective about how López Obrador and Trump and others are new authoritarians, that they are not the old way authoritarians that use power and military power to enforce, their position. Now, we, as a people, that we have seen how López Obrador has been trying to destroy institutions that it took us like 30 years of really hard work. I witnessed since the 90s how, the Electoral Institute was built year after year. So how can we fight against, against these new authoritarians? Is there something that we can learn from Turkey, from somebody else? Because, poll after poll, López Obrador is very high. He has 60%. And it seems that, how we say in Mexico, que es de teflón, like things don't stick to him. He has like Superman powers, that things that have been failing in his administration, he continues being strong. Like Trump, like what Trump said, that he can shoot somebody and he will be okay. So, mi pregunta es, ¿cómo podemos como oposición, la gente de México, combatir contra alguien que es un nuevo autoritario, que no usa la fuerza como se hacía en el pasado, donde realmente desaparecían a la gente, lo metían en la cárcel, había encarcelados políticos, y ahora no, ahora se cuidan de no hacer eso, pero de todos modos siguen siendo autoritarios. Entonces, ¿qué podemos hacer? Eso es todo. Gracias.
Thank you. Dave?
First, I remember this pollster I spoke to a minute ago, but I talked to it a minute ago, who described the López Obrador voter, pointed out that López Obrador is exactly as popular at this point in his presidency as every one of his predecessors, except for Peña.
That's correct.
So there is so the question is, what are Mexican polls really measuring? There's a lot of deference to authority in Mexico, and maybe it's just capturing that. But I think, without seeming to offer easy comfort, I'd say the accomplishments since the middle 1990s, they're real. They're part of the collective memory of Mexico. And although they're under attack, in many ways they have resisted attack. And I would say López Obrador has also done something, which is the history of recent history of Mexico is populist governments who borrow wildly, create debt crises, and then force reform to be combined with austerity because you have to tidy up the debt mess, like after López Portillo. And the one good thing you can say, or actually some good things you can say about López Obrador, but one of the most important is he's not leaving his country with a debt mess. It's got economic problems of many kinds. It's got serious environmental problems, but that the next period of opening reform will not be conducted under a debt crisis that forces the reforming government also to be an austere government. And so that, I think there are a lot of important possibilities for the Mexican future. Last thing to remember is in Mexico, successors always betray their predecessor. Always. I think if there's one rule of Mexican politics that I've learned, it's that the hand-chosen successor always betrays the man who chose him. And so it may be that the stooge president that López Obrador is looking for may, without a debt crisis, may be in a position to mobilize these forces in Mexican society that are there, that are so creative and so powerful.
Thank you, Dave. Danish?
Sí, sé, lo que López Obrador es igual de popular que como eran sus predecesores en el mismo año que se encuentra ahorita. ¿Qué es lo que las encuestas miden en México? Realmente, pues, es como muy relativo, ¿no? Los logros, digamos, desde 1990, pues habían ataques y todo, pero la historia la historia que nos cuenta es que crean crisis económicas, ¿no? Y grandes crisis económicas, las cuales cuando llega el siguiente gobierno, generalmente pues llegan a arreglar todo lo que el otro deshizo, ¿no? No deja, lo bueno, algo que sí puede decir bueno de López Obrador es que no deja al país endeudado. Y bueno, el próximo periodo no es una crisis mortal, ¿no? No es una crisis digamos que el país está verdaderamente en el suelo. México tiene algo que es muy constante, es que su predecesor siempre traiciona, más bien, el que llega al gobierno siempre traiciona a su predecesor. Entonces podemos prácticamente asegurar que el que llegue va a querer hacer las cosas, movilizar a la sociedad y todo para hacer las cosas bien.
We hope so, Dave. I have doubts that the next one will necessarily defeat or will try to defeat López Obrador. But let's see. Sara, en español y luego en inglés.
Ok, primero en español. Yo le quiero preguntar cuál es la función que tienen los partidos políticos de oposición. No están regulados para ser instituciones fuertes, pero tampoco se han adecuado a la nueva estrategia, sobre todo de comunicación política, leo yo, que tiene el presidente y ha avasallado con la oposición en este sentido. Entonces, ¿cuál es su recomendación, perspectiva, visión de los partidos políticos en México? I'll try to do it in English now. I'm asking about what about the role of the political parties? They are not legislated to be strong institutions, but they have to do it. Mainly, we have been seeing this because of how opposition has been unable to go into the legislative power. So what's your perspective, or what's the route for these institutions, democratic institutions, in order to get into the harmony among the powers? Thank you.
Well, I have to be very careful here because I'm telling, again, you're all people who live this life, and I'm just observing it. And I don't know your country as well as you do, but my perception from the outside is the Mexican parties are all about things from a long time ago. The PRI is about stabilizing the country after the revolution and trying to put it on its footing and trying to keep Mexico less dependent on the outside world than it was 100 years ago. And the PAN is all about the protest of Catholic Mexicans against a secularizing state. And the PRD is all about the anger that the events of 1968, the massacre at Tlatelolco, was never dealt with honestly. And that the people who went there with idealism and hope were brutally murdered by the military. And all of these things, and they're all powerful, but the PRI is about the 1910s and 1920s. The PAN is about the 1920s and the 1930s, and the PRD is about the 1960s and 1970s. And at some level, we say, all of that was a long time ago, and you have to deal with now. And the question for now is, how do you build a Mexico that has a proper social insurance system for the left, that is proper trade and guarantees of enterprise for the right, that is integrated into the world economy, and that is on its way to catching up to what it could easily and should be a country as wealthy as Spain, Portugal, and the southern part of Italy. That could happen. It would take 20, 30 years of strong growth, and you would catch up with Southern Europe. That's the goal, catch up with Southern Europe, enterprise, and a social insurance state.
Yeah. Danish?
Sí, dice que tiene que tener mucho cuidado en decir las cosas porque él no lo está viviendo como lo estamos viviendo nosotros. Pero su percepción es de que, por ejemplo, el PRI, pues surgió a raíz de la revolución, ¿no? Que pues fue para llevar, que sea menos dependiente que hace 100 años, ¿no? El PAN era para, pues, digamos, los mexicanos católicos que tenían cierta ideología. Y el PRD era el enojo de varias personas que murieron a manos de los militares, ¿no? Pero todos estos países, todos estos partidos fueron creados, digamos, en 1910, 1920, en los 60s y 70s. Son demasiado antiguos, o sea, llevan demasiado tiempo. Entonces, ¿cómo construyes un servicio social integrado, ¿no? A la economía, una economía integrada a la economía global? Digamos que la idea es que México se convierta en un país como el sur de Europa. Eso sería lo mejor que le pudiera pasar, y sería con un servicio social de Estado integrado y con economía global.
Gracias. We're gonna go to the last question that we have from Eduardo in English and then Spanish. Eduardo,
exactly. I'll do that. Thank you very much. This has been a terrific session. I have really enjoyed it a lot. Somebody asked, what can we Mexicans overseas do? And you, David, Mr. Frum, you talked about the powerful media. I will tell you 7 things that I do and that I invite my fellow Mexicans to do also. Number 1, stay informed about what happens in Mexico and stay engaged, just like we're doing right now. If there's a protest and you cannot go, you can help promote it and you can participate virtually, whatever you can do to stay engaged. Number 2, share information with our fellow Mexicans overseas. Number 3, I think this is key, is vote. We need to remember that Mexicans abroad have the right to vote in Mexican elections. We need to remind our fellow Mexicans about that. We need to remind them that they need to process their voting card, their INE, at their closest consulate or embassy. And they need to do that as soon as possible if they want to participate in the elections for 2024. Number 4, if you, like me, are a dual citizen, vote in U.S. elections also. And vote keeping in mind what's best for both the U.S. as well as Mexico. Number 5, contact your legislators. Don't be afraid of that. There's emails, there's phones, there's addresses. You can do that. I have some of them in speed dial for me. And contact your legislators both in Mexico as well as your U.S. legislators. Personally, I engaged my senator and also my local Congress lady a couple of times last year to alert them about threats to Mexican democracy and to ask them to please keep an eye on what was going to happen on November 13th in Mexico as well as February the 28th, so they could get an idea of how important this was in Mexicans being upset about it. Number 6, if you don't know what to do or know what to do but you don't feel you have the time to do it, donate to those who know what to do and are actively engaged to that. I donate to a number of organizations that promote voting, that promote sensible gun control legislation, so that hopefully someday we can stop weapons from going illegally to Mexico. Organizations that do fact-checking, CPG that protects journalists all over the world, and so on. It's like 20 organizations that I donate to. I am not rich, and that's why I'm not rich, because I donate a lot. Number 7, this is the last one. Stay close to your embassy or Mexican consulate. They give you the service, many services. One of them is, as I said, they help you get your INE, your voting card. And they represent, one thing that I love about the consular service is that they represent the state. They represent Mexico. They do not represent the government in turn. They do not represent the party in turn. If you are Mexican, that suffices for you to get help from them, to get support from them. They don't care if you are aligned with any particular ideology, and at least in theory they are neutral. I have had very good experiences with amazing people in the consular system. Yes, they have flaws, but they are great. So those are the 7 points that I wanted to mention, to offer to my fellow Mexicans abroad. Wow, ahora en español, sociedad.
Bueno, yo creo que es más un mensaje, es un mensaje más para la comunidad. No te preocupes.
Sí.
Gracias. Pablo.
No, ya me tengo que ir, estimados. Me gustaría despedirme.
Adelante, contigo nos despedimos y cierras. Despídete y cierro yo.
David, it was a pleasure. I'd like to thank you personally and in the name of Sociedad Civil and all the Mexican people listening to you. It was a great pleasure, and I'm very thankful to you, sir.
I learned so much from this conversation. I thank you for the hospitality.
Dave, thank you very much for your time. And I know it's Friday, it's 7 p.m. already. So enjoy your weekend. And hopefully we will have another exercise like this one in the future. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bueno, pues a todos los que nos acompañaron, muchas gracias. De verdad, muchas gracias. Este fue un ejercicio nuevo. Nunca habíamos hecho un espacio en inglés y español. Sé que la verdad aprendimos en la marcha. No lo teníamos perfeccionado y quizá hay muchas cosas que mejorar. Por favor, mándenos un mensaje con cómo lo vieron, si creen que vale la pena hacer otros espacios como este de esta manera, cómo lo podemos mejorar. La verdad es de que podríamos tener acceso a Dave es un ejemplo, pero podríamos tener acceso a muchas personas si creemos que esto añade valor. Si esto resulta interesante, resulta útil, y si todos quieren participar, por supuesto. Entonces, por favor, mándenme un mensaje directo, se los voy a agradecer. Y pues bueno, que tengan un muy buen fin de semana. Danish Pastry, muchas gracias. Yo sé que esto no es fácil, yo lo he hecho en el pasado, y la verdad es que se necesita tener, el cerebro se cansa. Y esto es pesado, se tiene que estar pensando, estar escuchando y estar pensando en la traducción al mismo tiempo. No, sí es una chamba. Muchas gracias. Y fueron poco más de 2 horas.
Con mucho gusto.
Así que,
y encantado.
no, yo sé, pero sí se necesita entrenamiento para eso. Yo recuerdo haber hecho esto y sí, termina uno con dolor de cabeza. Muchas gracias, de verdad. Si quieres dar un mensaje a a la comunidad Danish Pastry?
Pues realmente es importante todo lo que podamos transmitir a otros países. Y sí, una de las preguntas que más me llamó la atención fue eso de tener esta ambición de querer ser un país desarrollado y que seamos a la altura de lo que México debería de ser y no conformarnos con menos.
Exactamente, el umbral del merecimiento. Hay que trabajar sobre eso. Les mando un fuerte abrazo. La semana que entra vamos a estar con casas encuestadoras, así que preparen sus preguntas sobre los recientes resultados de las encuestas y por qué salieron las diferencias y por qué cada vez se cuestionan más a las casas encuestadoras y cuáles son las encuestadoras que son reales, las que son patito, las que entregan resultados a modo, las que preparan la encuesta, los resultados de la encuesta de acuerdo con el cliente. Hay que tener mucho cuidado, hay que saber de dónde sacar la información y los vamos a tener tan pronto tenga confirmación de las casas encuestadoras que van a estar con nosotros. Les mandaré, por supuesto, una invitación y los espero ver por allá. Tengan un muy bonito fin de semana, pásenla bien y a los que son padres, ya se acerca el Día del Padre, así que celébrenlo y los que no son padres, pues también pásenlo bien, padre. Cuídense mucho, que tengan buen fin de semana.
Síguenos en nuestras redes sociales. Estamos presentes en Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Spotify y YouTube. Encuéntranos como @SocCivilMX.
Pues muchas gracias, de verdad. No, muchas gracias. Hicimos algo diferente. Vamos a seguir innovando y ¿por qué no intentar cosas que pudieran parecer imposibles? Y lo vamos a lograr. Cuídense mucho. Les mando un fuerte abrazo. Buen fin de semana. Bye.